Hey guys, Marvin here. I moved inside to avoid a little summer thunderstorm in Texas. This is the Sleep Systems installment of the Ultimate Hiker's Gear Guide by Andrew Skirka. So we're going to go through that chapter. All right, so sleep systems are something that goes under you, something that goes over you, and possibly something that goes on you. And then some other bits. The Traditionally, uh, what goes under you is some sort of a sleeping pad and some portion of your sleeping bag. Talk about that in a minute. What goes over slash around and under you is typically your sleeping bag, and then you may wear something into your sleeping bag. We talked about sleep clothes in the Core 13. There are two of the 13 items in the Core 13 clothing. Um, but there are, other things you might wear as well, like your puffy jacket or your hat, your beanie, etc., just to extend the comfort range of your sleeping bag or sleeping system a few degrees lower if necessary. So again, I kind of like to look back at history a bit. So back in the day, there was one kind of sleeping bag, and it was a mummy sleeping bag if you were backpacking. If you were car camping, it was some sort of a rectangular sleeping bag. Um, and I remember the ones my parents had. They were by Coleman. They had a canvas outer and a flannel inner, and they were comfortable as all heck. But they rolled up, into something that was sort of the size of a hay bale and weighed just about as much, and could definitely not be carried on a backpacking trip. Um, so, you know, then there were mummy bags. Now there's a whole range of bags or bag styles, and we'll talk through a few of them. But let's start with pads. Again, 40 years ago when I started backpacking, there was one and only one choice, and that was what we call today a closed cell foam pad. It was 3/8 to half an inch thick. It rolled up into a rather large bundle. It wasn't very heavy. It wasn't very comfortable, and it didn't do a great job of insulating you from the ground. But that was sort of it, and we got along with it. Closed cell foam pads are still around. Some of them fold, some of them roll, um, but they still basically, I mean, the materials haven't changed significantly, so they still perform basically the same way. So the primary, as it turns out, purpose of a sleeping pad is to insulate your body from the ground. And the degree to which the pad insulates you is measured by an R factor. Um, an R of 2 is twice as insulating as an R of 1, and an R of 3 is 3 times as insulating as an R of 1. It's the same rating that you see for, fiberglass insulation that goes in your walls or in your attic of your house. And to give you some perspective, wall insulations like an R value of 13, give or take, and attic insulations like 25 or 30, give or take. And pads, sleeping pads, range from probably actually below 1 up maybe to 7. I think the highest I've seen is 6.9 in the research I've done. So there's basically the two styles. There's the foam, closed cell foam pads, and then there are the kind of air mattress pads. And they come in two subtypes, inflatable and self-inflating. The self-inflating ones still require you to inflate them a bit um, with breath or an inflation bag or whatever. Um, but that's, they have air in them. And typically some other sort of insulating material potentially that increases the R value. So um, the advantages to inflatable or air pads are higher R numbers, more comfort, Typically a little bit more weight, uh, but less bulk because they deflate. Um, and on the downside, if you happen to get a puncture in your pad, then you're sleeping on the ground unless you can repair it. So, in looking at what people who do a lot more hiking than I do seem to do, I would say the majority of people are carrying uh, an air pad of some sort. Um, a few are still carrying closed cell foam pads. Um, and then the folks that are really concerned about weight. Um, okay, so that's another advantage of the closed cell foam. It's lighter, and you can actually cut it to just basically go from your butt to your head, and that obviously takes out some weight. You use your backpack or something else under your feet um, to provide a little bit of insulation from the ground. And so if you're really counting ounces and grams, um, a cut down closed cell foam pad is absolutely the lightest weight option. It's probably pretty close to the lowest R number option. But if you're hiking the Appalachian Trail for most of that season, or if you're hiking in the desert Southwest, so long as it's not too uncomfortable, it's really, really light. Um, the folks that invented kind of this inflatable pad market is a company called Thermarest. They're still around, still going strong, and I think they still have some of the best products on the market. There are other contenders. The absolute lightest inflatable pad I found was the Thermarest Uberlight Short. It is a narrow, short pad that basically goes from your hips to your head. It is inflatable, and it weighs 6 ounces. The longer version of that, just to give you an idea, that would fit under a typical 6 foot or under person, is 8.8 pounds. R value of 2.3, if I remember correctly. So, 2.3, just to put it in perspective, is, that's a late spring to early fall kind of an R number. That's not going to insulate you very well from relatively cold ground. So another little hidden gem is in their lineup that several people pointed out is the X-Lite Women's. I don't exactly know why it's called Women's because it's 72 inches long. It's slightly narrower, but it has an R value of 5.9 and a weight of 12 ounces. So in terms of R value per ounce, it's a pretty clear winner out of the field of pads, and pad manufacturers. And that's what I'm personally going with. Full disclosure, I'm a cold sleeper. And so I'm going to tend towards the warmer end of things. And you'll hear that bias a little bit as I go through. But then there are other X-Lite and other X-Therm pads. As the R value goes up, the weight goes up. But that's pretty much the pad systems. And so the key to picking a pad is getting a length and a width that makes sense for you, getting an R value that makes sense for the season that you're going in and the rest of your sleep system, and hitting the buy button. All right, so let's move on to the sleeping bag, right? The thing that you're going to be more or less inside of. We kind of talked about mummy bags. So, a mummy bag is shaped kind of like a sarcophagus. It has typically a zipper down one side. There's typically a draft tube along that zipper that's filled with insulation and keeps air from leaking in around the zipper. There's frequently a draft tube that kind of goes around your shoulders to keep drafts from coming down from the top. There's a hood that comes over the top of your head potentially with a draw cord that you can cinch up. Um, and if you lay on your back inside of a mummy bag and you cinch that cord down, you can basically get to the point where only your nose is sticking out. And if you're doing mountaineering or high altitude expeditioning, this is what you're sleeping in, and nobody gives a second thought to options. For the rest of us, there's an argument that says that's a little bit of overkill. There's an argument that says, hey, that draft tube down the side, that's extra weight. Hey, that hood that you're probably never going to use as it was intended is extra weight. And if you really do need to keep your head warm, you can wear your beanie. And if you need to be warmer than that, well, you can put on your puffy and put up the hood. And you can sleep in that. And so you kind of don't need that whole hood bit. And believe it or not, getting rid of the hood, saves 4 to 6 ounces, which 4 to 6 ounces is material if you're trying to stay under 10 pounds or whatever. The next argument is, hey, you probably don't need that insulation that's underneath you. That sounds a bit weird until you hear the rest of the argument, which is, hey, insulation comes from, or the insulating effect comes from the loft, from basically how thick that layer is, and the part that's underneath you is compressed down to 0 and is therefore providing no warmth. In fact, the argument really goes, hey, the only way you're insulated from the ground is by your sleeping pad. And so you could get rid of all the insulation that's underneath you and not lose any warmth. And so that gets you into what are now called quilts. And these quilts are more or less exactly what they sound like oftentimes. They're basically just a big down comforter with a, not a big, they are basically a down comforter. The slightly more sophisticated ones will have a drawstring at the bottom that allows you to make a little bit of a foot box or bring it in around your feet. If you go kind of another step up, there's the so-called sewn foot boxes, which basically sew up to kind of knee level and have a little, sack down there to put your feet in. And then then there's no zipper. It's just open, and so you lay on your sleeping pad, and you put this quilt around, your feet inside the foot box if there is one, and drape the quilt over you. There are quilt attachment systems, cords or bands or whatever, that kind of allow you to fasten the quilt to the sleeping pad, which makes it a little bit more of a sleeping bag kind of a thing, but still there's no insulation underneath you. The advantages are obviously, number one, that it's significantly lighter for the same temperature rating as an equivalent sleeping bag, particularly if it's a mummy bag. And for some people, at least, who are active sleepers, if you've got a good attachment system to the pad, they're a little bit roomier than a mummy bag, particularly one of the same weight. You get a little bit less of that claustrophobic feeling. You can roll around a little bit easier without kind of getting the sleeping bag all jacked up around you, which if you're an active sleeper like I am, does happen. So those are kind of the advantages. The disadvantages are the attachment systems can be fussy. It's hard to get rid of all the drafts. And you do get some kind of insulation around certain parts of you that are not fully compressed from a sleeping bag that you lose with a quilt. So between those two, they're kind of modified sorts of deals, where maybe they eliminate the hood, or they eliminate the hood in the draft tube, or whatever. But you kind of got to pick you kind of got to pick your approach. I'm personally going with a hoodless sleeping bag that has a 3/4 length zipper and no draft tube, that I'm going to use a little bit like a quilt. I'm going to put the zipper underneath me. Um, and if it's warm, I'll zip the zipper down a bit and fold the quilt back, or fold the sleeping bag back. And if it's colder, there's a cinch string at the top that I'll tighten up, and then potentially um, potentially wear the hat, or the puffy, or whatever, if we're getting cold. All right, so that's kind of sleeping pad, sleeping bag, and the options that are out there. And as with almost all of this gear, the trade-offs are various kinds of functionality, um, and weight. So a few other things that maybe should have been at the beginning of the video, but we'll just sort of talk about here. The first is insulating materials. So the insulating material in a sleeping pad is air, or air pockets. Just to put it, insulation is almost always provided by air or a vacuum in like a double-walled Yeti cup or whatever. But if you have air and it's trapped and it's not moving and convecting, it's a really, really good insulator. So your down jacket, your fleece, pullover, whatever, what they're really doing is trapping a certain amount of air, keeping close to your body and keeping it from moving around, and that helps you retain body heat. So in the sleeping pad, there's air trapped in small pockets, and sometimes there's reflective or other sorts of insulating material in there, and that's what creates the R factor. In a sleeping bag, the insulation is provided by whatever the sleeping bag is filled with, and there's two options really. There's down, and there's synthetic. And the synthetics, there's all sorts of different synthetics out there, that have various different sorts of properties. They're almost all made out of some sort of polyester, but those are kind of your two options. So let's talk about the synthetics first. The theory was for a long, long time that since the synthetic materials were made out of polyester and therefore didn't absorb water, they were potentially warmer when they got wet. Nothing is warm when it's wet. It's just not. All of the insulating properties that you're expecting just disappear when something is wet. And so what everyone tells you is just don't get your sleeping bag wet, because if you do, it doesn't matter what it's made out of, you're going to be cold. So another advantage to synthetics are that they are less expensive for the same kind of temperature rating. The disadvantages are that they're less compressible, and therefore your sleeping bag is going to take up more space in your pack than an equivalently rated or performing down bag. So the advantages of down are that it's highly compressible, and that it is the warmest per unit weight insulator that sleeping bags are made out of. The disadvantages are that it's expensive, and that it's historically kind of had a knock that it's a little that down is collecting down is a little bit hard on the geese. There's now responsibly sourced down, where you can literally find out where it came from, that kind of mitigates that concern. And like I said, nothing's going to be warm when it's wet. So if your synthetic bag gets wet or your down bag gets wet, you're going to be cold. Um, so, and then the last thing to sort of say about down is you will find what's called a fill power rating. Typically, it's between 700 and 900 or 950. But basically, it's the volume that a given quantity, given weight of down will fill. So the higher the number, the higher the quality of the down, and the more insulation you'll get um, for a given weight of down. And this is true whether we're talking about sleeping bags or down pants or down jackets or down vests or down whatever. And then the other thing is there are now treatments that make the down somewhat water resistant. It's certainly not waterproof, but it decreases the amount of water that the down absorbs from moisture in the air, and it does help some. So if you can afford it, my opinion is that a down sleeping bag is, absolutely going to be your best choice. If you can't afford it, then you should probably allocate a little more room in your backpack because your synthetic bag is going to take up double or more, excuse me, the room of a down bag. So that's kind of the insulating materials and how you look at them. And obviously, if you want a 950 fill power hydrophobic down, that's going to be your most expensive option, but it's also going to provide the greatest insulation for the least weight. So we've talked about temperature rating. Probably should have talked about that up front, but all right. So every sleeping bag, virtually every sleeping bag is going to come with a temperature rating. And there are standards that not everybody follows for rating the temperature at which, the lowest temperature at which a sleeping bag will perform. So if you hear somebody say, hey, I've got a 10-degree bag, or I've got a 30-degree bag, or I've got a 40-degree quilt, or whatever it is, that's either the manufacturer's best guess, or it's a number that was taken from a standardized test that was performed by either a standard specified by ISO in the United States or EN in the European Union. As if that wasn't confusing enough, there's a couple of different numbers. So there's what's called the survivability number, and there's what's called the comfort, or the survivability rating, and then there's the comfort rating. And they're typically 10 to 15, or 15 to 20 degrees apart, with comfort being obviously higher than survivability. So again, if someone's done the testing and they say, hey, this is a 10-degree bag, in almost every case, that 10 degrees is the survivability rating. So if you buy the bag thinking, hey, I'm going to take this out and it, temperatures are going to drop into the mid to low teens, and I'm going to be peachy, you're not going to be peachy. Survivability is exactly what it sounds like. You're not stage 4 hypothermia or dead, but you're not comfortable. You didn't sleep. You shivered through the night. So make sure that you've got a pretty good idea what the comfort rating of the sleeping bag or sleeping system that you're buying is, and that it's at or below the lowest temperatures that you expect to encounter on your trip. And if you do that, you'll be comfortable. And if you don't, you're taking the risk of being pretty miserable. Again, like I said, if something unexpected happens or, whatever, you can always add layers of clothing inside the sleeping bag to, and particularly to your head, to get the comfort rating or to extend the range of your sleep system. Um, but at some point, you're going to run out of things to put on. And in every case, the majority of the insulation that you're receiving comes from your sleeping pad and then your sleeping bag or quilt or whatever it is you decided to go with. And then the last thing to talk about is pillows. You can get what most people use is either nothing or some sort of a stuff sack with some clothes or whatever in it. I personally, for 1.7 ounces, ordered a little down pillow because I'm a little bit of a pillow weirdo. And so for 1.7 ounces, it's absolutely a luxury item. But I think I'm going to sleep better than I will with a stuff sack full of granola bars and stinky socks. And I think a good night's sleep is worth 1.7 ounces. So there are inflatable pillows as well. They're in about the same weight range. I don't personally like inflatable pillows. If you do, that's awesome. But whatever you decide to take, I would recommend that you try it out in your nice comfy bed at home, because if it sucks in your bed, it's almost certainly going to suck on the trail. And so play around until you find something that you can sleep on at home, and then there's a reasonable chance you've got a winner for the trail as well. All right, well, thank you for watching.